Is it worth risking children's academic achievements by teaching them in Yiddish?
That's a question that I can't answer. I'll tell you why. If it's right to teach in Yiddish, what I'm about to say makes no difference. If what I'm about to say matters, then Yiddish has a very limited context. And the one who has to make the decision whether Yiddish is principal, primary or not is the Rebbe. Nobody can make such a decision. This is a decision about chinuch, but how important Yiddish is, that really has to be made by a Rebbe. I don't even think a chassid can decide how important Yiddish is. Having said that, I'm going to answer the question a little bit, to the best of my abilities. Yiddish is very, very important. The Rebbetzin Chayamushka would encourage people to speak to their children in Yiddish. And she would say that Yiddish saved many lives because it was international currency. Jews recognized each other by Yiddish. A Yid was overseas. I know a man told me a mice. I had a malamed, his name was Rabbi Fuchs, who during the war spent a while in Kobe, Japan, until the America started up with Japan. Japan started up in America. They were living in the islands of Japan. And after December 7th, 1941, they were moved to Shanghai, where they lived the remainder of the war. But they were living in Japan, and it was a Friday night, and he was standing on a street corner, and a man rolls down the window of a fancy car and says in Yiddish, "Was macht a Yid?" And he offered him a ride, Nebuch. And of course he wouldn't get into the car. The end of the story was he would go visit this Yidl, and he had a son and a daughter. He started teaching them. They moved to Eretz Yisrael and both built frum homes. And it all started because a man knew a few words in Yiddish, was macht a Yid. And she always said, the Rebbetzin used to say that Yiddish is international currency. A Jew recognizes a Jew all over the world because of Yiddish. And it's true that to a very great extent it's lost. So Yiddish is important. In addition to that, there's of course also the idea of the Yiddish is a Yiddish agolus sprach. Jewish people were always mitzuyanim. They're always distinct from non-Jews in having what the Rebbe calls nesichas a Yiddish agolus sprach. It's a language of the exile. In other words, it's not a holy language, it's a language of the exile, but it's a language of exile which is distinct to the Jewish people. Like by the Sfardim you have Ladino, and there was Old French, which is a language that Rashi spoke. It was a uniquely Jewish dialect. So today it's Yiddish. Yiddish is the language of the Jewish people, certainly Ashkenazic Jews. It's been this way for hundreds of years. And to say that there's nothing about Yiddish is false. And to say there's no Kedusha in Yiddish is also false. There's no question that it says in the Siches, Habal Shem Tov ha'ya'omer teire beis lamed aleph, B'loshen Yiddish dafke, and there's a whole discussion in Chassidus why he did this. So there's no question that Yiddish is very important. But I want to say several things to the contrary. Number one, if you want Yiddish to be your language, you can't be a hypocrite. If you're going to speak to your children in Yiddish, speak to your spouse in Yiddish. The idea that adult couples speak to each other in English and the little kids get Yiddish is so hypocritical. I mean, I have a cousin. I remember as a kid, one of my cousins had a little boy and they spoke to them in Yiddish. And the boy turned 5 or 6, he started speaking in English. And the mother says to the little boy, "Was redest nicht in Yiddish?" He says, "Mommy, Yiddish is a baby sprach." When you watch your parents talk to each other in English, they talk only to you in Yiddish, it's wrong. If we're speaking Yiddish because Yiddish is sacred, Yiddish is sacred. It's not just something we give our children. Now I understand that there are many people who hold that it's still worthwhile, in quotes, it's better than nothing, and so on and so forth. But the truth of the matter is, if we're going to take Yiddish seriously, Yiddish has to be our language, not English. There are communities of Jews where they speak exclusively Yiddish. This is the language of the street. They speak English, 3rd, 4th generation Americans speaking English with an accent, literally, because Yiddish is the language of the home. And if you're not going to make Yiddish language of the home, then speaking to the children in Yiddish is a very partial approach to this Indian of speaking in Yiddish. And then there's the second issue. And the second issue is at what cost? Lubavitch specifically has a very high percentage of Baalei Tshuva, at least 50%. They have a difficult enough time learning how to read in Hebrew and understand Hebrew. And to converse in Yiddish for them, especially if they get married after being here for a short time, is very, very, very difficult. And their children go to our schools and they just don't speak the language. And it creates an enormous challenge where the kids can't learn. They pashut can't learn. So there's this whole phenomena of memorization where the kids memorize in Yiddish, they sing in Yiddish, they memorize in Yiddish. Is it worthwhile? Is it correct, or is it yotzes charib efseda? Are we losing more than what we gain by speaking to the children in Yiddish? And I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but I'm going to say it. I don't think it's worthwhile. The kids have to learn. Because when the kids don't learn, when they're very little, they don't learn when they're bigger. And the consequences of that we see all around us. We're not talking here about kids being a little bit compromised. In the big picture, the cost of holding on to Yiddish when it's not a spoken language. They don't speak, they don't understand the language. In other words, if you want to speak Yiddish to our children who come from non-Yiddish speaking homes, there's a very simple way to do it. To speak it in the halls. I went to Alateira as a child. We had children in our class who came from homes that spoke only English. They had no trouble with Yiddish because the Malamdim spoke in Yiddish. The language of the whole, we spoke in Yiddish. We didn't just learn Chumash in Yiddish, we spoke in Yiddish. The conversation was in Yiddish, the classroom was in Yiddish. You didn't have a choice. So you put a kid in an environment where the language is Yiddish, he picks it up in no time. But if everything is English and they're memorizing words in Yiddish, they don't learn the language. And it's a very, very, very costly inhibitor on their ability to learn. And for children to learn is very, very important. It's not just important for their academics and for their aptitude and their scholastic aptitude. Ultimately, it's the get to the Yiddishkeit mamish. And I know this is controversial, and I know that I'm going to get flack, but you asked me the question, I gave you the answer. My answer.